Preface this segment by this is not just going to be me shitting on Notre Dame for the next 10 minutes, because the reality is that USC bears just as much responsibility as Notre Dame in terms of this rivalry pause. And I think any college football fan, regardless of who your team is, disappointed in terms of Lincoln Riley's comments. I think, quite frankly, it's a little hypocritical to sit there and say, oh, well, it's Notre Dame's fault for not being as flexible with us because we play a Big Ten schedule. Therefore, the tradition of them playing in mid to late October should be changed. And technically speaking, yes, most non-conference games are played, usually in late August, early September, and then you play out the rest of your conference schedule and that's it. But there's also another part of this conversation where why can't we just keep it the traditional way of, well, that's where they've always played it and that's what it should be. Now, Notre Dame bears some responsibility in this too, right? I think there's a couple of layers to the story. First and foremost, the fact that they are getting the automatic bid just for being in the top 12 is absurd in of itself. I don't care who agreed to it. I don't care what happened there. The reality is that no other school in this country gets that type of privilege or advantage. I'll call it an advantage because that's what it is. It's a total advantage. Every other team in this country has to win the games that are on their schedule and has to win games in their conference. So, yes, I am going to be a little bit more critical of Notre Dame in that fashion, even though part of me does love the fact that they're independent in a sense. But there's another part of me that says, well, if they don't want to be criticized so much, you could also just join the ACC or hold out until 2030 and do the Big Ten. But that's neither here nor there. The reality is getting kind of back to this, as I rightfully be critical of both of them, is they're both just being incredibly stubborn. That's really what this is coming down to. And this is really just another snowball effect to how much the college football playoff is implicating not only the transfer portal, not only the college football calendar, but most importantly, just the rivalries within our sport. And why college football is the greatest game in the world is because of these games that have been played for decade after decade after decade. And it's, quite frankly, it's one of the games I always look forward to every year. I actually just sat down and talked with my buddies in terms of, hey, what are some bucket list games that you would love to go to in terms of stadiums or matchups? And one of the games that always comes to mind is USC Notre Dame. I love the fact that Notre Dame has such passionate fans, and the people at South Bend, Indiana are always just so loyal and so consistent. And quite frankly, do I have my disagreements with them? Absolutely. But have they always been a pleasure to talk to? 7 times out of 10, I would say so. And, I always welcome more Notre Dame fans to definitely check into the podcast. And also I'd love to have a Notre Dame beat writer on the show as well. But nevertheless, I mean, that's really what this kind of comes down to, right? Because if you're USC and you can somehow get this game in either week 0 or week 1 or week 2, if you win this game and somehow they end up with 10 wins or 10-2, they're going to go back and say, oh, well, remember when we beat Notre Dame, 3 months ago? Does that win still matter? And then if they lose, then they get the flip of the coin of, oh, well, we played Notre Dame week 1 and, we're such a different team now. And, this, that, or the other. And quite frankly, it's a total double standard. And I get that's the perspective that they're coming from. But ultimately, if you actually believe that you're the best team in the country, you should play everybody that's on your schedule. I don't care what the story is. I don't care what the circumstances. The reality is that you're the best team in the country. You should want to play the best teams in the country. And quite frankly, I just don't see that out of either one of these teams. Now, granted, you have to take that comment with a little bit of grain of salt, right? Because these games are scheduled years and years out, and you don't necessarily know how strong these teams are going to be, It's just unfortunate that our college football interests are overbearing or overriding a classic rivalry that, quite frankly, is not only changing the landscape of college football, but it's pushing a lot of blue blood fans away. And it should. Quite frankly, it should. If that's the reality check that our leaders of college football need, then so be it, right? And if just flipping to Notre Dame real quick, there's really no reason why we can't just play in mid-October. I feel like that's kind of the best of both worlds for both these teams. Now they did schedule a home-to-home series versus BYU, which quite frankly, I think that's very commendable that they decided to. I think December 22nd is the no, I think on December 22nd they did that. So that was last week. But very commendable for them to add BYU, who's been one of the most consistent teams in college football over the past decade, even before they joined the Big 12, even when they were an independent, they were, pretty consistently winning, 8, 9, 10 games, whether it was Sataki or whether it was Bronco Mendenhall too. Both those dudes have just been, absolutely great for that program. So I respect Notre Dame for having a backup plan for when this inevitably wasn't going to work. And now if you're USC, you kind of turn around and sit there and say, who do you schedule in this circumstance? And my bottom dollar, if I was a betting man, which I am not, by the way, that's why I don't do the gambling shit on this show. But if I'm a betting guy, I think USC should probably hit up Stanford and say, you know what? How about we have a little Cali game going on here, and that game probably sells itself, regardless of where Stanford is at in their season. But when you kind of look at these, I just kind of want to take a look at these schedules real quick that they have, right? Because I just want to point out too before I get into the schedules real quick is that both these teams, both their reasons are perfectly valid and perfectly logical, and we're not criticizing that at all. And at the same time, too, there's a balance that you kind of have to find, right? Because if you really are worthy of the college football playoff, you should be able to beat anyone in the country. But I think there also really needs to be a big conversation of, if you're Notre Dame, why would you think that you would need your own memoriam of getting into the college football playoff? And they didn't get screwed or anything. They didn't earn it this year. It doesn't mean that they can never earn it. But the reality is, when you're independent, you have to go 11-1 just about every single season. Maybe there's a circumstance you go 10-2 if your worst loss is against two top 5 teams in the country. But that's never here nor there. And I'm not going to get into them bailing out of the Pop-Tart Bowl, because that's really not relevant for this conversation. But let's take a look at Notre Dame's schedule real quick. So presumably you're starting off the season versus Wisconsin at Lambeau Field, which that's going to be electric stadium. Then how about this doozy for your next 4? You're hosting Rice, you're hosting Michigan State, you're on the road versus Purdue. That game's played every year, so people in the comments don't say anything bad about that. Then you're on the road versus North Carolina. So yeah, that's your that's your power that's your power schedule if you're Notre Dame. And like I said before, you have to take those with a grain of salt, because a lot of these games are scheduled way in advance. And I do think there is a valid argument that the ACC does bear a little bit of responsibility of, well, how come the best team that the ACC is scheduling for Notre Dame, SMU? How come they can't throw a Clemson in there? Or what about a Cal? Or, just some team like that where, it would just bear a little bit more excitement. Shit. How about Notre Dame versus Florida State? That game sells itself. I know, you can argue that Mike Norvell is kind of I think, the sitting duck of the 2026 season, kind of like what we saw with maybe Sam Pittman, for example. But those are the games I think, if you're Notre Dame, I think that's really kind of the games that you want to try to exploit, right? And I get that they do that with Stanford. I get you do that with Purdue because that's part of your tradition. You do that with Boston College to a lesser degree, but let's just kind of hold our horses here in terms of all that, right? It's a catch-22 because yes, they bear a little bit of responsibility for it, but at the same time, I don't always think it's entirely fair to criticize a team for their schedule when a lot of the times you don't necessarily know how that schedule is going to turn out. Because it's easy to say in hindsight, oh, well, yeah, of course it was an easy schedule. So you got to take that with a grain of salt too. But USC really doesn't have much more room to talk because outside of, yes, you do have to play Ohio State and Oregon, which they host both of them, by the way. So, kudos to USC, and also coming off the number one recruiting class in 2026. But let's just kind of take a quick look here. So start off the year with Fresno State and Louisiana, whatever. Obviously, you can see based off that schedule where they can kind of substitute that in. And right now they only have 11 games. So we'll see. Well, like I said, I suggested Stanford, but we'll see. Then you go on the road versus Penn State, which Penn State's always a tough team to play. Then you go on the road versus Rutgers, presumably the week after. We'll see. And then, you do host Washington as well. So all of this is me saying is both these teams are being incredibly stubborn in terms of their scheduling. There's no reason why neither of these teams can afford to play each other. In fact, I think if it's a close game, more than likely it's probably going to help you in some way. Now, I think Notre Dame, to some degree, that you can perhaps make the argument that scheduling Texas A&M perhaps hurt them this season, and I think that's I don't think you can completely unargue that, but the reality is there's only so many teams that can make the college football playoff every year, and this is really just another example of just two teams as being stubborn because they want what's best for their own programs. And again, I'm not faulting that, but I think there needs to be a bigger conversation in terms of you know scoping everything around a playoff when in reality is that most of these kids are not going professional and that there's other ways to reward a team for a good season other than making the playoff. How about